You woke up this morning and started obeying. You stopped at a red light because a metal box told you to. You didn't cross the street in the wrong place. You paid for the coffee instead of taking it. You filled in a form, followed a sign, waited your turn. 100 small commands you never agreed to, written by people you will never meet, enforced by strangers with badges and paperwork. We live our entire lives inside an invisible cage of rules, and most of the time, we don't even feel the bars. So it's worth realizing how recent that cage is. The oldest written law humans have ever found is only about 4,000 years old. Police forces, courts, governments as we know them, younger still. And our species has been around for roughly 300,000 years, which means that for the overwhelming majority of human existence, there were no written laws, no police, no courts, no judges, no prisons, no government of any kind. For almost all of human history, nobody was in charge. And here is the part that should stop you. It wasn't chaos. Picture what you'd expect from a world with no laws and no police. The strong take whatever they want. The biggest, most violent person becomes king. It's every man for himself, survival of the fiercest. That's the story in our bones, and it is almost exactly backwards. The people who actually live this way, hunter-gatherer bands, are described by the anthropologists who studied them with one phrase again and again: fiercely egalitarian. Not gently equal, fiercely equal. Because keeping everyone equal took work. The anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent his career on this puzzle, comparing dozens of societies across every inhabited continent. What he found is that these bands weren't missing a system of order. They had a fierce one, just upside down from ours. In our world, power flows from the top down. A few give orders, everyone else obeys. In theirs, it ran the other way. The whole group, acting together, would gang up on any individual who tried to boss others around, hoard more than his share, or act like he was better than everyone else. Boehm called it a reverse dominance hierarchy. Instead of one alpha dominating the group dominates its would-be alphas. And their tools were brutal in their own quiet way. First, ridicule. They'd mock and tease anyone getting too big for himself. Then shunning. People would simply stop cooperating with him, stop sharing, stop speaking. Then the threat of ostracism, being pushed to the edge of the group. And in the last resort, for someone who truly would not stop, banishment, or even death at the hands of the community. As Boehm put it, in these societies, arrogance amounts to a crime. The single oldest law humans seem to have lived by wasn't written anywhere. It was simply this: nobody gets to be better than anybody else. You can watch this law in action. The anthropologist Richard Lee lived among the Jew/Hawansi of the Kalahari, and to thank them one year, he bought the biggest, fattest ox he could find for a feast. To his shock, everyone mocked it. A bag of bones, they said, skin and gristle, barely worth eating. He was hurt and confused, until an elder explained. When a young man kills a lot of meat, the elder said, he starts to think of himself as a big man, and the rest of us as his servants, and we can't allow that. So we tease the meat every single time to cool his heart and keep him humble. In a world with no police, the crime they policed hardest was thinking you were special. But here's the question that really matters. Ridicule and shunning only work if the person cares what you think. So why did it work so completely? Why didn't people just ignore the group and do whatever they wanted? Because in a hunter-gatherer band, there were no strangers. You lived your whole life among a few dozen to at most a couple of hundred people, every one of whom you would need. The man you humiliate today is the man whose meat you'll beg for next week. The woman you cheat is part of the only safety net you will ever have. Every favor, every insult, every lie, every act of cowardice was remembered permanently by the exact people your survival depended on. The first police force in human history was everyone you knew. Gossip was the courtroom. Reputation was the verdict. And the sentence, being cut off from the group, could kill you. Because in that world, alone meant dead. And there was a second thing holding it together, something we've almost completely lost. There were no walls, no borders, no citizenship, no property you couldn't carry. If a dispute turned poisonous or a person became unbearable, you didn't call a lawyer, you left. You walked to another band, or the group itself simply split apart and went separate ways. Nobody could force you to obey, but nobody could force you to stay either. Power had no walls to trap anyone behind. The ultimate freedom wasn't a right written in a document. It was the open door at your back. Now, for the genuinely dangerous, a murderer, a bully who would not stop, someone who put the whole group at risk, bands had a final answer, and it was chilling in its simplicity. There was no trial, no jury, no jail. The community itself, by quiet agreement, would decide that a person had to go and act together to end the threat. Justice wasn't handed to a specialist in a robe. Everyone was the police, the judge, and the executioner at once. So did they have leaders at all? Some did, but not the kind you're picturing. The anthropologist Pierre Clastres studied peoples in the Amazon who had chiefs and discovered something that broke his brain a little. The chief had no power to command anything. He couldn't give a single order that anyone was obliged to obey. His role was almost the opposite of a king's. He was expected to be generous to the point of poverty, often the poorest man in the group, constantly giving his things away. And he had to be a gifted talker, settling quarrels with patient words, because he had no force to settle them with. If he ever tried to actually command, people would just ignore him or leave. Clastres realized these societies weren't primitive versions of a state that hadn't grown up yet. They were societies that had seen the shape of power and deliberately built themselves to prevent it. What he called the continual effort to prevent chiefs from being chiefs. They didn't lack rulers by accident. They refused them on purpose. And it gets stranger still, because it wasn't even a one-way street. In the 19th century, on the Great Plains of North America, peoples like the Cheyenne, the Lakota, and the Crow spent most of the year scattered in small, aggressively equal bands with no chiefs at all. But for a few weeks each autumn, when the great bison herds came through and thousands of people gathered for the hunt, they did something remarkable. They switched on a government. They appointed chiefs and what the anthropologist Robert Lowy flatly called a police force. Men who could issue orders, confiscate property, whip anyone who hunted early and ruin the herd for everyone, and if a person resisted, kill him. For those few weeks, this was a real coercive state. And then the hunt would end, the herds would move on, and that entire government would simply dissolve, and everyone would go back to being free equals. The anthropologists David Graeber and David Wengrow described these leaders as play kings. Their power switched on for a season and switched off again. They could put on a government like a coat, wear it for the harvest, and take it off when the work was done, because they understood it was a tool, not a destiny. Sit with how alien that is to us. We treat our rules as permanent, natural, almost sacred. A red light is a red light forever. A law is a fixed feature of reality. These people treated authority as a costume you put on for a specific job and shed the moment it wasn't needed. They had a freedom we can barely imagine. They were never stuck with their own rules. So what happened? Why did the parade of possibilities end and the whole world get locked into laws and kings and police? The answer, more than anything else, was farming. When humans stopped roaming and settled down to plant fields and store grain, three quiet catastrophes unfolded for the old way of life. First, you could no longer just walk away. Your entire survival was now buried in a field and a granary you couldn't carry. So the open door at your back slammed shut. Second, for the first time, some people could accumulate vastly more than others. Full granaries, herds, land, and wealth like that doesn't stay equal for long. And third, villages swelled into towns, and towns into cities, packed with thousands of people who did not know one another. And the ancient system, which ran entirely on everyone knowing everyone, simply broke. Gossip cannot reach a stranger. Shame cannot humble a king with an army. And you cannot vote with your feet when your whole life is planted in the ground. The moment we couldn't leave and couldn't know everyone, the invisible rules stopped working. And we had to make them visible. And so, around 4,000 years ago, in the Sumerian city of Ur, a king named Ur-Nammu did something no human had ever needed to do before. He had rules carved into clay, the oldest written law code we have ever found. Crimes and their punishments, laid out in a cold, new logic. If a man does this, then this is the price. A few centuries later, Hammurabi of Babylon went further, carving 282 laws onto a great stone pillar and standing it up in the public square of a crowded, multi-ethnic city for a population of strangers to see. And to make people obey rules that no longer came from their own community, he claimed the ultimate authority, that the gods themselves had handed him the law. Notice exactly where written law appears. Not among the small bands who knew each other and needed no reminding. It appears in the first crowded cities of strangers, ruled by kings. Writing didn't invent rules. It invented rules for people who no longer knew or trusted each other. So, what did ancient humans do before rules existed? The honest answer is that they never lived without rules. They lived without written ones. Their laws weren't carved in stone or enforced by anyone in a uniform. They were carried in every single head and enforced by everyone at once, through teasing and shame, through generosity that was really an obligation, through the ever-present threat of being left alone in a world where alone was a death sentence. The system that kept order wasn't law and police. It was everyone watching everyone, remembering everything forever. And that is where this leaves us with something genuinely uncomfortable to hold. For 300,000 years, the thing that kept a human being in line was never a law or a badge. It was the eyes of the people around them, people who knew their name, remembered their every failing, and held the power to cast them out. It was intimate and relentless and total. There was nowhere to hide and no such thing as a stranger, and no possibility of ever escaping what your community thought of you. It was, in a word, suffocating. And so we built something extraordinary to escape it. We invented written laws, courts, and police, a system run by strangers, applied to strangers, precisely so that we could finally live among people who don't know us at all. We created the rule of strangers so that we could become strangers. Free to move to a city where no one remembers our worst day, free to start over as someone new, free to simply not care what the village thinks. That freedom is real, and it is one of the most precious things the modern world has ever given us. But it came at a price the ancients never had to pay. In handing the job of keeping each other good over to a machine of paperwork and uniforms, we quietly agreed to stop being one another's keepers. The oldest law was that everyone was always watching. We wrote our laws down so that at last, no one would have to. And we are still finding out what that means. Whether a world of free strangers is a world of liberty, or simply a world where you can fall and vanish, and no one who knows your name is watching closely enough to catch you.